Enter into a realm of fright, blacker than the darkest night. Your sanity hangs by a thread. Welcome to the House of Dread.
Have you ever heard the saying that the past is in the past? It's a phrase that we often use to comfort ourselves and others, urging us to look forward to the future and to leave our troubles behind. The idea is that what has happened before should stay there, allowing us to grow and move on without being weighed down by past mistakes or heartaches. Now, to a certain degree, this makes perfect sense, as we can't undo what has been done. But is it always true that the past doesn't still affect us? Sometimes, the echoes of yesterday can reverberate through our lives in ways we never anticipated, shaping our present and even our future. Never underestimate the undeniable power of the past to shape our lives. Because when those skeletons finally come out of the closet, they can shatter the illusions of our so-called perfect lives, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truths we've been avoiding. Enter Jake and Sarah. Jake and Sarah, a spirited young couple, embarked on a quiet Friday night adventure. They were both in their early 20s, their faces a vibrant mix of excitement and curiosity. Sarah, with her long auburn hair cascading down her back, had a sparkle in her emerald eyes. She was always up for a thrill, her spirit unyielding in the face of the unknown. Jake, on the other hand, was a bit more cautious. Possessing a strong sense of responsibility, his eyes were always scanning their environment and ensuring their safety. Their destination was an old, nearly abandoned mall on the outskirts of town. This once bustling hub of activity now stood as a haunting testament to time and change. The mall still held a few remaining stores, their windows dimly lit, and a movie theater that continued to flicker with life. However, the majority of the mall was eerily empty, its vast expanse filled with echoes of laughter and footsteps long forgotten. The couple had chosen this unique location to catch a movie, drawn by the allure of a less crowded and more intimate experience. It just so happened that the movie they were going to see was a horror flick. It was one that Jake had been anticipating for a long time. Sarah wasn't a big fan of horror movies, and was actually more of a rom-com kind of girl. However, she understood how much Jake had been looking forward to the release of this new film, and so she agreed to go with him, hoping they could still enjoy the experience together despite her personal preferences. Unfortunately, however, not long after the movie started, Sarah began to quickly realize that she was in over her head. The initial excitement that filled the air quickly dissipated as the film unraveled a story filled with graphic violence and gore. With each passing scene, the tension in the room grew thicker and more intense. The sound of squelching, cracking, screaming, and bones breaking began to make Sarah's stomach churn. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her heart beginning to race with anxiety. Sarah simply couldn't believe the sheer brutality that was playing out on the screen. The once thrilling and exciting atmosphere now seemed suffocating, and for Sarah, it was becoming increasingly unbearable. Finally, Sarah realized she couldn't take it anymore, her eyes filling with tears. She suddenly turned to Jake and asked if they could leave. She was hoping he would understand her distress and that they could leave this gruesome spectacle behind and maybe catch a different movie. But Jake was having the time of his life. The excitement that had been building within him for weeks was finally being lived out on the big screen. He was totally immersed in the experience, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He hesitated at Sarah's request for them to leave, torn between the movie he had been eagerly anticipating for so long and his girlfriend's discomfort. As it turns out, Jake chose the movie. He rationalized that since he had been looking forward to this movie for such a long time, that he could make it up to Sarah later, perhaps by watching one of her rom-coms, which was his least favorite type of movie. In Jake's mind, it was a simple game of compromise and balance. But to Sarah, it felt like Jake was being totally dismissive, disregarding her preferences and not considering her feelings at all. The two began to have an argument, struggling to keep their voices barely above a whisper for the fear of disturbing the other patrons. Finally, in a fit of frustration, Jake pulled out his car keys, tossed them at Sarah, and told her she could wait for him in the car until the movie was over. At least that way, he could finish enjoying his film, and Sarah wouldn't have to be burdened with watching another second of the movie that she had clearly lost all interest in. Moments later, Sarah found herself sitting in Jake's car, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. She had hoped that Jake would understand her discomfort and choose her feelings over a movie. Instead, he had chosen the gory spectacle on the big screen. And as she sat in the car, she couldn't help but wonder if their relationship was as strong as she had once believed. To pass the time, Sarah turned on the radio and began scrolling through her phone. She soon found herself on a call with one of her girlfriends, venting about Jake's behavior. She explained how he had chosen the movie over her feelings, and how it left her feeling unimportant and disregarded. Her friend listened sympathetically, offering words of comfort and understanding. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah began to notice people exiting the mall, indicating that the movie had finally ended. She watched as couples and groups of friends walked by, chatting excitedly about the film they had just seen. Sarah continued to sit in the car, hoping to see Jake come out, but as the minutes turned into what felt like hours, Jake never appeared. Sarah's anxiety began to grow as she watched car after car leave the parking lot, and Jake was still nowhere to be seen. She tried calling Jake on his cell phone to figure out what the hell was going on, but it went straight to voicemail. As the parking lot grew emptier, Sarah's mind began to race with thoughts of what could have possibly happened to Jake. She wondered if maybe he had run into one of his old buddies on his way out and was still inside the mall talking with them. But that idea quickly went out the window when Sarah began to witness lights inside the mall being sequentially turned off. Now she knew something was wrong. Sarah quickly snatched the keys out of the ignition, hopped out of the car, and began dashing towards the entrance of the mall. Just as she reached the doors, the mall security guard was walking up in preparation to lock them. Sarah frantically knocked on the glass doors, begging the security guard to allow her to come in for just a few minutes so she could find her boyfriend. The security guard was hesitant, seeing as though he was quite tired and ready to call it a day. Sarah promised she would only need a few minutes, and the security guard reluctantly agreed to let her come back in. Sarah raced back to the movie theater and ran into one of the attendants who was shutting everything down for the night. She asked the attendant if he had seen her boyfriend, Jake, providing a detailed description of his height and build, along with the clothes he was wearing. The attendant swore up and down he hadn't seen anybody that fit Sarah's description. Frustrated and totally confused, Sarah asked if she could revisit the screening room where her and Jake had been watching their movie. The theater attendant started to tell Sarah no, as he was trying to shut everything down in preparation to go home. But the look of desperation on Sarah's face and the urgency in her voice prompted him to reconsider. Finally, the attendant agreed to escort Sarah to the screening room, in the hopes of providing some clarity and closure to her unusual request. As they entered the dimly lit screening room, the movie theater attendant shined his flashlight throughout the dark space. The room was empty, with all the seats totally vacant. Sarah's frustration and confusion grew as she scanned the room, searching for any sign of Jake. She simply couldn't understand why he wasn't there. As they walked down the aisle, the attendant asked Sarah if she was sure Jake was in this theater. She confidently replied that they had been watching the movie together but ended up getting into a fight, and that's when Jake had told her to wait in the car. The attendant nodded, understanding her concern, but he was also becoming increasingly puzzled by the situation. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. This just wasn't making any sense. Finally, she turned to the attendant and asked if he could check their men's room. She explained that maybe Jake was in the middle of handling a personal emergency. The attendant hesitated for a moment, glancing at his watch, but ultimately agreed to check the restroom. Sarah was holding her breath as the attendant disappeared into the men's room, calling Jake's name, hoping he would respond. Unfortunately, however, when the attendant re-emerged, he stated that the restroom was completely empty. Sarah was outdone and totally perplexed, and by now the theater attendant had run out of patience. Although he sympathized with Sarah's dilemma, he also explained that it was now time for him to shut down for the night, and he needed Sarah to exit the theater. As Sarah exited the theater, she began calling out for Jake, but never got a response. Her fear, frustration, and feelings of abandonment swelled inside her like a dark storm. She couldn't help but replay the events of the night in her mind, searching for any clues as to where Jake could have disappeared to. The thought of him simply vanishing into thin air was too terrifying to comprehend. As she made her way back to the exit of the mall, Sarah's heart was pounding, and her thoughts about what had happened to Jake grew increasingly dark and tragic. She began to wonder if Jake had somehow been abducted, possibly trapped in the trunk of someone's car, bleeding to death. The horrific thoughts that filled her mind were endless, each one more chilling than the last. Was he in trouble? Did he need help? The questions swirled through her mind like a relentless whirlwind, leaving her feeling more lost and alone with each passing moment. Finally, Sarah began to rationalize that since she had the keys to Jake's car, she could drive to the nearest police station and file a missing persons report. Yes, that was it. The thought of getting help from the authorities brought a momentary sense of relief to Sarah's growing sense of dread. By now, the only lights illuminating the nearly abandoned mall were the security lights, and all was quiet. Sarah began to suddenly realize that she was the only one left in the empty mall. This totally creeped her out, and she began sprinting towards the exit, her anxiety reaching a fever pitch. As the glass doors of the mall came into view, Sarah began to feel like she could see light at the end of the tunnel. Through the doors, she could see that Jake's car was still outside, and she felt a wave of relief washing over her as she was ready to proceed with her plan of going to the police to tell them about her missing boyfriend. Unfortunately, however, as Sarah pushed against the glass doors that served as the entrance and exit to the mall, she was terrified to discover that she couldn't get them to open. She pushed and pulled, rammed the doors with her shoulders, and even began kicking them with her feet and pounding them with her fists. But the doors remained sealed. Sarah thought about the security guard that had allowed her to come back inside the mall just before he was preparing to lock the doors, and she frantically began calling out for him, but to no avail. Her cries for help, laced with genuine fear and desperation, merely echoed through the empty corridors, bouncing off the empty storefronts and the cold, hard floor. Sarah was absolutely terrified. The reality finally hit her that she was now locked inside the dark, creepy, and lifeless mall. It was like a bad dream, or worse yet, a harrowing nightmare. In a panic, Sarah immediately pulled out her cell phone to call 911, only to make the horrifying discovery that her battery was dead. She forgot she had used up all of her power when she was sitting in the car talking on the phone, complaining to her girlfriend about Jake not wanting to leave the theater. And of course, right when she needed her cell phone the most, it was out of service. Sarah was in hysterics as she broke down on her knees and began to cry. How in the hell did she end up here? All she wanted to do was watch a movie with her boyfriend, and now she was stranded in this creepy-ass mall with no way to call for help. This simply could not be happening. Exasperated, Sarah sat in the floor, her head in her hands, and her back resting against the glass doors of the mall. She was hoping some random person would drive through the parking lot and just happen to see her, but so far, the vast expanse of asphalt remained completely empty, devoid of any human presence. Sarah went back and forth between periodically glancing into the void outside and looking back into the creepy void inside the mall. Her thoughts chaotically flipping between hope and despair. Everything was so eerily quiet. The silence was deafening and utterly terrifying. Moments later, Sarah heard what sounded like a door opening and closing in the distance. She couldn't believe her luck. Maybe the security guard hadn't left after all. Her heart pounded with a newfound sense of hope as she scrambled to her feet, desperately calling out for him. She sprinted in the direction of the sound, her legs carrying her faster than a tiger chasing its prey. The dimly lit mall blurred around her as she called out, her cries filled with panic and desperation. Sarah found herself venturing deeper and deeper into the mall, chasing after the sound of that door. She knew whoever the hell that was, she couldn't let them get away. They just might be her only way out of this terrible predicament. And finally, Sarah had to stop running momentarily to catch her breath. Standing in the middle of the mall, she whirled around, searching for any sign of life, anyone who might be able to help her out of this nightmare. Again, she called out, desperate for someone, anyone to respond to her pleas for help. And she did indeed get a response, but it wasn't the one she had hoped for. Sarah. What in the hell was that? A deep demonic voice called Sarah's name, echoing out of the darkness of the dead mall like a haunting whisper. Sarah's legs almost gave out beneath her as the chilling voice seemed to crawl right under her skin, burrowing right into her very soul. Sarah froze in terror as the voice called her name again, this time closer. She turned around, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy and unresponsive. The terrifying voice grew louder, and she began feeling a cold breeze. In her attempt to escape, Sarah stumbled and fell, landing on the cold, hard floor. Sarah looked up, only to now see a group of shadowy figures moving towards her, tall and thin with their glowing red eyes and twisted, contorted faces. Overwhelmed with fear, Sarah's body continued to betray her. She tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She could only watch in terror as the vengeful demons began closing in on her with their outstretched and twisted hands. Sarah managed to push herself up off the floor and began trying to run, but the demons were now in hot pursuit, continuing to call her name as if taunting her. Sarah. Pumped with adrenaline, Sarah pushed herself to run faster, her legs trembling and burning with exhaustion. The mall around her now seemed to shift and twist, becoming a labyrinth of darkness and terror. As she turned a corner, she saw a faint light up ahead. It was the entrance to a storage room, and the door was slightly open. Totally unaware of what was inside, but desperate to get away from the angry demons who were hot on her tail, Sarah pushed the door open and stumbled into the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Gasping for breath and totally exhausted, Sarah stopped and began listening very intently to see if she could still hear the angry spirits on the other side of the door. But she heard nothing. Sarah quickly began to barricade the door, trying to protect it against any potential intrusion. As Sarah was catching her breath, she began to explore the dimly lit storage room. The only source of light came from a few flickering overhead bulbs, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The constant on and off of the lights made the space feel creepy and ominous, like a place that had been left untouched for ages. Surrounded by rows of dusty shelves, piled high with old and forgotten items, Sarah's eyes fell upon a stack of old, dusty cardboard boxes. With a shudder, she slowly began to approach them. She carefully lifted the lid of the top box, revealing a treasure trove of old newspaper clippings and documents, faded and yellowed with age. Her eyes widened as she read the headlines, her heart sinking as she learned the shocking truth about the history of the mall. Skimming through the old news articles, it was revealed that the mall had been built over an old, abandoned grave site. As it turns out, the developers had repurposed the area due to the high demand for commercial space and the relatively low cost of acquiring the neglected land. Sarah's mind was spinning. She could hardly believe what she was reading. Oh, but there was more to the story. As she delved deeper into the piles of documents, she stumbled upon even more chilling revelations. The repurposing of the land had disturbed the resting places of hundreds of bodies that had to be exhumed during the construction process. The local residents petitioned and protested, but they were no match for the corporate greed that had invaded their once peaceful town. In addition, Sarah discovered that a significant number of missing persons reports had been mysteriously linked to the mall. People from all walks of life had mysteriously disappeared without a trace on the mall grounds. In fact, Sarah came across a particularly strange article with a headline that read, "Woman mysteriously disappears at local mall." And strange enough, the description of the missing woman sounded eerily similar to Sarah herself. The mounting strange disappearances caused customers to become fearful and avoid the mall, and the retail space lost a significant amount of traffic and sales. All of this had taken place just a few short years after the mall's grand opening. As a result, in less than 5 years, the mall had become a shell of its former self and was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy and permanent closure. Sarah began making the connection between the tumultuous history of the mall and the terrifying paranormal activity that she was experiencing. It was very likely that those angry spirits were the vengeful souls of the dead that were once buried on the land, haunting the mall and abducting innocent patrons, all in the name of seeking justice, revenge, and retribution. Sarah's heart nearly stopped as there was a sudden and violent pounding on the door to the storage room. The documents she held in her hands slipped from her grasp and scattered across the floor. Sarah! The demonic spirits were back, calling Sarah's name as their ghostly wails and evil laughter filled the air. The force of their pounding was so intense that the barricade she had created began falling apart. Sarah watched in horror as the door shifted and groaned under the relentless assault from the other side. Her hands trembled as she scrambled around the room looking for a way out, but there was no escape. The pounding grew louder and more intense, the door barely holding on as the demons on the other side grew more aggressive. Sarah knew she had to act fast if she wanted to survive, but she couldn't run, and she sure as hell couldn't hide. Suddenly, the door burst open, torn from its hinges by the relentless force of the vengeful spirits. The demonic souls were now entering the room. They stood before her, their twisted faces contorted with rage and their eyes glowing with an eerie, sinister light. As they reached out to her with their malevolent smiles and sinister grins, Sarah knew that it was time to say good night. Sarah screamed as she felt a firm grip on her shoulder, shaking her. It was her boyfriend, Jake, waking her up to let her know the movie was going off. Sarah sat up in her chair, eyes wide and hands trembling. She looked up and saw the credits rolling on the screen, her eyes darting around, observing that the entire theater was empty, except for her and Jake. Turns out that Sarah had simply fallen asleep, but the gory scenes and gruesome imagery from the movie had seeped into her dreams, causing her to have a terrible nightmare. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off her lingering terror. Deeply disturbed and unsettled, Sarah stood up from her chair and began heading to the restroom, telling Jake she needed to splash some cold water on her face. Inside the bathroom, Sarah turned on the faucet and leaned over the sink, allowing the cold water to run over her hands and soothe her rattled nerves. She was so glad that it had all been just a dream, and all she wanted to do now was go home and get some sleep. That was until she looked up in the mirror and her blood ran cold. The reflection staring back at her was not the youthful and vibrant face that she once knew. Instead, it was a grotesque display of death and decay. Her skin now hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of the rotting flesh beneath. Her eyes, once windows to her beautiful soul, were now empty, hollow sockets, sunken with dark circles that spoke of exhaustion and pain. Her teeth were brown, yellowed, and jagged, as if they had been filed down by years of torment and suffering. Her hair, thin and brittle, now fell from her scalp in clumps, revealing the pinkish gray of her skull beneath. The smell of decay filled the bathroom, a nauseating stench that seemed to cling to every surface and invade every pore. It was a scent that whispered of graveyards and all things dead. Yes, the sight that greeted Sarah from the bathroom mirror was that of her own rotting corpse. The sight was so ghastly that Sarah couldn't even scream. She backed away from the mirror in absolute horror, her hands touching her face, feeling the decomposing flesh that her reflection revealed. Once again, Sarah could feel her legs turning to jelly, threatening to give way beneath her. Sarah burst out of the bathroom, desperate to escape the horrifying reflection staring back at her from the mirror. She stumbled into the main lobby of the theater, calling for Jake, but there was no sign of him. In fact, the entire theater was dark and empty. Dust, grime, and cobwebs covered the ticket booths and concession stands, and the posters on the walls were faded and torn. The whole damn theater was closed and abandoned. The once vibrant and lively space was now an empty shell of its former self. Sarah ventured out of the theater and into the mall, and immediately she could tell something was seriously wrong. There were no patrons, no staff, and no sound but the echo of her footsteps. The dusty, abandoned mall stretched out before her like a desolate wasteland, its empty corridors a testament to the passage of time and lost memories. It was as if the place had been closed for years, and in fact, it had. Old faded signs littering the floor, boarded up storefronts, and an eerily quiet atmosphere sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Again, she called out for Jake, but there was no answer. The once bustling mall was now, quite literally, dead silent. Sarah began frantically searching for a way out. She approached every door, only to find them sealed shut, reinforced by wooden barriers and rusty corrugated steel. Sarah's mind was blown as she tried to make sense of what was happening. First her horrifying reflection, and now this? And where the hell was Jake? Had she somehow been transported to another world? Suddenly, Sarah flashed back to the dream she had when she uncovered the articles about the mall's history, particularly the article about the woman who mysteriously disappeared and how eerily similar the woman's description was to her own. That's because the woman from the article was Sarah. She was one of the missing persons from the mall's tainted and twisted past. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She was living a nightmare, trapped in a cycle that had been repeating itself for decades. The angry spirits of the mall had claimed Sarah and made her one of their own, forcing her into a ghostly existence trapped within the cold concrete walls of a place that used to be filled with laughter and joy. Her once loving boyfriend Jake was no longer there and had most likely moved on with his life, adding another layer of despair to Sarah's predicament. The sight of the abandoned mall now echoing the emptiness in her heart. Sarah's mind raced as she came to terms with the terrifying truth. She was dead, and the mall was her purgatory. Unable to leave, her ghost was destined to haunt the abandoned mall, reliving the same night of her disappearance over and over again, for all eternity. While it's true that the past can't be changed or undone, it's important to remember the power the past possesses to shape our present and even our future. The mall, built on the unsettling foundation of an old grave site, became a chilling symbol of the unresolved tragedies that continued to haunt the living. In Sarah's case, her endless cycle of torment served as a chilling reminder of the unspoken secrets and unfinished business that still lingered inside those walls. Never underestimate the influence of the past on your present and the terrifying shadows it can cast on your future. Because just like Sarah, you may find out that the ghosts of yesterday can become all too real, turning your world into a living nightmare from which you cannot escape.
If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Until the next tale of terror, this is Victor Bloodborne. Stay dreadful.